Wounded Knee, 1973. A prequel, the 1960s were a tumultuous period in American history, defined by the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, and an explosion of iconic music. Amidst this cultural and political upheaval, the American Indian Movement, AM, was founded in 1968 in Minneapolis, Minnesota, born out of the pressing concerns of Native Americans living in urban areas. AIM's mission centered on addressing systemic poverty, political disenfranchisement, racial discrimination, and police brutality faced by Native communities. Early on, AM members established neighborhood patrols to prevent unjust arrests and curb police abuse targeting Native residents. The organization was shaped by leaders such as Clyde Belcourt and Dennis Banks, both Chippewa from Minnesota, and later saw the rise of Russell Means, an Oglala Lakota, as one of its more dynamic and assertive voices. In 1972, AIM organized the Trail of Broken Treaties, a cross-country caravan that brought together roughly 900 participants traveling from Seattle and San Francisco. Along their journey, they stopped at reservations across the West, spotlighting long-standing grievances against the U.S. government. The trail culminated in Washington, D.C., where AIM members occupied the Bureau of Indian Affairs, BIA, headquarters from November 2nd to November 8th, 1972. After tense negotiations, an agreement was reached, including promises to address economic, social, and educational injustices faced by Native Americans, along with funding for participants' return travel. Earlier that year, AM had also gained national attention following the tragic death of Raymond Yellow Thunder in Gordon, Nebraska. In response, AM took over Gordon Community Hall, pressuring local authorities to create a human relations board to investigate racial grievances, a move hailed as a significant victory. Just weeks before the infamous siege at Wounded Knee, tensions escalated in Buffalo Gap, South Dakota, where Wesley Bad Heart Bull was killed by Harold Schmidt. Prosecutors charged Schmidt with involuntary manslaughter, sparking outrage among AIM members. Protests in Custer, South Dakota, turned violent, resulting in the burning of the local courthouse and Chamber of Commerce. This incident marked a turning point in how the U.S. government viewed AM, leading to increased surveillance and branding the group as militant. By 1973, turmoil on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota reached a boiling point. Oglala Sioux leaders called upon AM for support against tribal President Richard Wilson, whose tenure since 1972 had been fraught with allegations of corruption, abuse of power, and disregard for tribal council protocols. After efforts to impeach Wilson failed, tensions surged. In response, the U.S. Department of Justice deployed 50 federal marshals to Pine Ridge, prepared to suppress any potential civil unrest. These events set the stage for the dramatic confrontation that would unfold at Wounded Knee. The takeover begins on February 27, 1973. Approximately 200 members of the American Indian Movement, AIM, arrived in the historic village of Wounded Knee, seizing control of key locations including the trading post, museum, gas station, and several churches. Wounded Knee held profound symbolic importance as the site of the tragic 1890 massacre, where U.S. Army forces killed between 250 and 300 Lakota Sioux, suffering only 25 casualties themselves. AIM leaders chose this site to demand reform in tribal governance and draw attention to the systemic injustices faced by Native Americans. Russell Means, a prominent AIM spokesperson, called for congressional investigations into conditions on reservations, corruption within the Bureau of Indian Affairs, BIA, and the enforcement of Native treaty rights. The news of the takeover quickly reached U.S. Marshals stationed at Pine Ridge, prompting them to establish roadblocks at all entry points to the village, effectively isolating Wounded Knee. Throughout the occupation, law enforcement agencies, including the U.S. Marshal Service, the FBI, and the BIA, coordinated efforts to maintain control. Despite these measures, AIM supporters circumvented roadblocks using overland routes to deliver supplies. Sporadic gunfire between AIM members and U.S. forces marked the early days of the standoff, as AIM fortified their defenses with trenches, bunkers, roadblocks, and patrols. Veterans of the Vietnam War among AIM's ranks contributed valuable combat expertise to their efforts. The troubles begin. AIM leaders made it clear that the occupation would end if their demands were addressed. On March 1st, Senators James Abu Rezk and George McGovern, along with aides from Senator Ted Kennedy's office, arrived to discuss the grievances. They agreed to hold congressional committee hearings and reassign some BIA officers. Despite this, the roadblocks remained in place, restricting movement in and out of Wounded Knee. On March 4th, AGM proposed to leave Wounded Knee under the condition that the U.S. government withdraw its forces and allow the Lakota to resolve their disputes internally. Ralph Erickson, special assistant to the Attorney General, countered by offering amnesty from immediate arrest if the occupiers surrendered by March 8th, abandoned their weapons, and identified themselves. Negotiations collapsed on March 8th, with both sides refusing to compromise. Tribal President Richard Wilson, notorious for his controversial leadership, mobilized his Goon Squad, a paramilitary force which frequently engaged in armed exchanges with AIM supporters. When federal authorities removed roadblocks on March 8th, believing this would encourage the occupiers to leave voluntarily, AIM saw the move as a victory. More supporters poured into Wounded Knee, bringing food and supplies. Escalation of the standoff on March 11th. Tensions escalated further when 4 postal inspectors entered the village to assess postal property. AIM members, suspecting espionage, detained the inspectors as hostages but released them after 4 hours. In response, federal authorities reinstated roadblocks. That same day, AGM and its Lakota allies declared the creation of the Independent Oglala Nation, ION, asserting their sovereignty and escalating the conflict to a new level of defiance against federal authority. The provisional government of the ION, the Independent Oglala Nation, ION, formally established a provisional government, grounding its legitimacy in a return to the Treaty of 1868. ION leaders declared their intent to negotiate with the United States on a nation-to-nation basis. Their demands included sweeping changes within the Bureau of Indian Affairs, direct meetings with federal administrators, the removal of Tribal President Richard Wilson from office, suspension of the tribal constitution, restoration of governance under the Indian Reorganization Act, and treaty-based negotiations. The tension escalated further the following day when FBI agents pursued a van attempting to enter Wounded Knee. The pursuit ended in a firefight, during which an FBI agent sustained a wrist injury. Support and continued conflict in an effort to bolster AIM and Lakota resistance. Supporters formed the Wounded Knee Legal Defense/Offense Committee. Through negotiations, they secured an agreement allowing 6 lawyers to bring carloads of food into the village daily between March 26th and March 31st. However, Richard Wilson and his forces intercepted these supplies, seizing all food at roadblocks they established. Sporadic gunfire continued, with both sides repeatedly breaking and reinstating ceasefires. AIM security, federal forces, and tribal police were frequently engaged in exchanges. On March 26th, heavy gunfire erupted when Wilson erected a roadblock just outside the federal perimeter. During the clash, U.S. Marshal Lloyd Grimm was severely injured, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. As violence escalated, the situation grew increasingly dire. Tragic losses and a fragile ceasefire by April 2nd, the conflict had claimed its first lives. Frank Clearwater and Lawrence Lamont were killed as a result of intensified gunfire. Their deaths led to a temporary ceasefire as both sides grappled with the rising human cost. Despite multiple attempts, negotiations faltered until representatives from the Civil Rights Division and 6 FBI agents convened with AIM and Lakota leaders. Discussions centered on the misuse of tribal funds and widespread complaints of harassment by Wilson's forces. A step toward resolution on April 5th, AIM leaders and U.S. government representatives reached an agreement. The terms required Russell Means to voluntarily surrender and be taken into custody. Additionally, AIM leaders agreed to disarm by April 7th at 7 a.m. In return, a White House representative pledged to meet with AIM leaders to discuss grievances and the possibility of re-evaluating Indian treaty obligations. The agreement marked a tentative step toward addressing the underlying issues, though the scars of the conflict would endure. The final stages and aftermath of the Wounded Knee occupation following his arrest, Russell Means posted bond and left for Washington, D.C. but the terms of the agreement quickly unraveled. Means asserted that AIM never agreed to surrender arms until a White House meeting had concluded. By April 24th, negotiations resumed at Wounded Knee under the leadership of Kent Frizzell. The U.S. government continued to prioritize dialogue over military action. On May 5th, Leonard Garment, a presidential advisor, sent a letter to Frank Fools Crow, promising that White House representatives would meet with the Teton Sioux to discuss the 1868 treaty, contingent upon the peaceful evacuation of Wounded Knee. That same day, both parties signed a dispossession agreement. The agreement outlined specific measures to be implemented on May 9th at 7 a.m. All individuals in Wounded Knee were required to vacate the area, identify themselves, and submit to arrest if they had outstanding warrants. By May 8th, half of the AIM members had already departed. The following day, government forces entered Wounded Knee, collected weapons, and escorted the remaining AIM supporters to the government roadblock for processing. Lawyers from the Defense Committee were present to oversee the procedure. Of the 129 individuals processed, 110 were Native Americans. By the end of the day, federal forces demolished both AIM and government security bunkers, officially bringing the occupation to an end after 71 tense days. The aftermath of the occupation ended due to several pressing challenges, including a lack of food, electricity, and medical supplies. However, its impact continued to resonate. On July 17th, a Senate joint resolution was proposed to establish an Indian Policy Review Committee. This initiative aimed to reassess the legal relationship between Native Americans and the U.S. government and support the development of more effective policies. Despite the symbolic victory, the struggle for justice was far from over. In 1974, Russell Means ran for tribal president at Pine Ridge, but lost to Richard Wilson. Simultaneously, he and Dennis Banks faced trial in St. Paul, Minnesota, for their roles in the Wounded Knee occupation. The trial, lasting over 8 months, concluded with the dismissal of all charges due to judicial misconduct. A quiet war resumes. The years following the standoff were marked by violence and unrest. Between 1973 and 1976, Pine Ridge endured the highest per capita murder rate in the United States, with 2 FBI agents among the casualties. This period, often described as a quiet war, reflected the deep divisions and unresolved tensions on the reservation. Today, Pine Ridge remains the largest community in what is considered one of the poorest counties in the United States. The legacy of the Wounded Knee occupation serves as both a symbol of resistance and a stark reminder of the ongoing challenges faced by Native American communities. Thank you for watching the video until the end. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss any new videos from us. What do you think about today's topic? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found the video helpful, feel free to share it with your friends and family. We hope you had a great time. See you in the next video with even more exciting content. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out.